Welcome to Comparative Constitutional Law course. My name is Matthew Dukula. I will be taking a module on constitutional design, presidentialism, parliamentarism, and semi-presidentialism. I work as a research associate at the School of Policy and Governance at SemiPresidential University, Bangalore. I've been working there for the last couple of years, and my research interests are broadly in the field of constitutionalism and democracy and decentralization and urban governance in India. So this is a very exciting module, and I'm really glad to be here to discuss this module with you. So let me just start off by saying what I would be discussing over the next 30-40 minutes. The broad course outline of this lecture, I'd start off with constitutional design, the idea of constitutional design and why it's very relevant for us to understand constitutions, and why it is very important for us to understand the different systems of government. Followed by the three forms of government, that is presidentialism, parliamentarism, semi-presidentialism, and then I will be discussing the key differences in these three systems, followed by a discussion on choosing the right system of government and what are the bases on which we choose one system or the other. And finally, I'll be discussing India's constitutional choice, why we decided the system we chose. And of course, in the end, I'll sum up the course and what we learned over this unit. So let's start by really understanding the idea of constitutional design. I think it's very important for us to understand that constitutional design plays a fundamental role in the way a society is governed. A constitutional design embodies the institutional design the constitution makers wishes to entrench, and hence it's really important for us to understand what sort of design a constitution has, because it has a large role to play in say, some policy outcomes and policy choices. So the way the constitution is actually designed has a huge role to play in the way the society actually works. So hence, understanding constitutional design becomes key. And I would like to state here that constitutional design is actually an institutional choice, and that is where presidentialism, semi-presidentialism, parliamentarism comes in. It is an institutional choice. The exercise of constitution making is ultimately about making institutional choices. Which institution should be vested with the powers to govern the society? What system of government can best serve the interests of the people? So these are some of the questions constitution makers would be asking while designing a constitution, while coming up with a constitution. So the most fundamental part of constitutional design is about understanding what form of government we should take when, say, a new democracy is formed. And for this lecture, we have focused on three forms of government, that is presidential system and parliamentary system and semi-presidential system, because these are the three fundamental ideas of government that exist, and hence we have focused on that. Even if you look at some of the authoritarian regimes, we could even classify some of them as presidential systems, but we are largely dealing here with republican democracies with the constitution. Okay, so let us begin. So before you can see two people. One is President Pranab Mukherjee, and the other is President Barack Obama. If you look at it, it's very clear that both of them are presidents. But the question is, do they have similar powers? The question is, can President Mukherjee do what President Barack Obama does? And I think anyone who has some knowledge of the way the world works knows that Barack Obama is much more powerful than President Mukherjee. And the reason is that the design, the system of government is different. Both are presidents, but both have different powers. Both operate in a different manner. So it's a very simple, it might sound very silly, but the main point here is that it's not the terms that matter. It's not whether you are a president or a prime minister. It's not the terms that matter. It's a system of government which matters, right? So again here, we have two people before you. One is Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The other, I don't know how many of you are actually aware of it. This person is a Prime Minister of France, Mr. Manuel Valls. So Prime Minister Manuel Valls and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, right? Do they have similar powers? Both of them are prime ministers. But the fact is that they have very different powers. In fact, you'd be more familiar with this man on the screen on the extreme right. That is Francois Hollande. That is the president of France. And of course, you have Obama and Modi also here. These are the leaders that we are more familiar with. Why? The simple reason is that these are the leaders who actually exercise a lot of power. And if you look at it, Obama represents a presidential system of government, US. Modi represents a parliamentary system of government, which is India. And Hollande represents a semi-presidential system, which is in France. So the main point I'm trying to emphasize here is that it's not the terms that matter, whether there's a prime minister in one country or a president in another country. What matters the most is the fact that they have different systems of governance. And these systems are enshrined in the Constitution. And it's the way these systems play out that determine how they actually have a role to play, what the powers of these leaders are. It's not the terms. It's not whether there's a prime minister in one country and a president in another country that matters. It's the system that matters. Okay, so that's the simple point I'd like to stress. So I'll now start with each of the system, but before that I'll just give a very brief overview of what all the three systems are about. So a presidential system is a system of government where the head of the executive is directly chosen by the people. The president is also the head of the state and is not accountable to the legislature. A parliamentary system is a system of government in which the executive is chosen by a legislature and the head of the state is not usually the head of the government. The executive, consisting of the prime minister and cabinet, is collectively responsible to the legislature. A semi-presidential system is a system of government in which the head of executive, that is the president, is popularly elected and exists along with the prime minister and cabinet. The prime minister and cabinet named by the president is accountable to the legislature. So the basic point that is emerging out of this is that the presidential system, the head of the state is the head of the government, whereas in a parliamentary system, head of state and head of government are different, whereas in a semi-presidential system, you have head of state and head of government. One is the prime minister, one is the president. And the other major difference we have already noticed is in the aspect of accountability. To what extent the executive is accountable to the legislature. So let's quickly move on to the presidential system and what it basically means. So Giovanni Sartori, a scholar who's analyzed the systems of government, has highlighted three prerequisites for a presidential system. The head of state is popularly elected. Legislature can neither appoint nor remove the government. The head of state is also the head of government. So these are the three factors that make a system of government a presidential system. So countries with a presidential system include Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Cyprus, Indonesia, Kenya, Maldives, Mexico, Myanmar, Nigeria, Paraguay, Philippines, United States, and Zimbabwe. But the key points that are emerging, at least from Sartori's definition, is that the head of state is popularly elected, and the fact that the president has considerable powers. So let's move more into the presidential system. The president has a fixed term in office and cannot be normally removed by vote of confidence. The president appoints members of the cabinet. He's usually free to appoint who he wishes. Sometimes he is required to take also the consent of the legislature. And most importantly, neither the president nor the members of his cabinet are members of the legislature. So the government and the executive and the legislature are completely different. So that's the main point that's emerging. That is, president cannot be removed by the legislature, president exists by himself, president can appoint whoever he wants in his cabinet, and the president and cabinet are not members of the legislature. That's the key point of the presidential system. Of course, if you look at the history of the presidential system, the first presidential system came in the United States in 1787 with the enactment of the US Constitution. One of the guiding principles behind that constitution was the idea of separation of powers. And this idea was derived largely from the ideas of scholars, philosophers like Locke and Montesquieu. So it's very interesting to note how French and English scholars had a role to play in the foundation of US. So if you look at your screen, you can see James Madison. James Madison, one of the founding fathers of USA. He was also one of the authors of the Federalist Papers and also later a president of the United States. In the Federalist Papers, he describes the importance of separation of powers. So let me quote from Federalist Paper number 47. This is a very famous quote from the Federalist Papers. The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So what's interesting here is the fact that even an elected system can be tyrannical. That is, if all the powers are concentrated at the same person. So the US system is centered around the idea of separation of powers. And the presidential system's key point is also the separation of powers. So let us now move from the presidential system to the parliamentary system. Again, according to Giovanni Sartori, for a system of government to be called a parliamentary system, it needs to meet the following criteria. The government must be appointed, supported, and dismissed only by the parliament. So a parliamentary system is a system of government in which the executive, consisting of the prime minister and the cabinet, is chosen by and collectively responsible to the legislature. The prime minister heads the cabinet and also selects the members of the cabinet. And so it's a system where the executive, that is the prime minister and cabinet, is completely dependent on the legislature. That's the defining feature of the parliamentary system. Countries with the parliamentary system include Australia, Bangladesh, Canada, Denmark, Germany, India, Israel, Italy, Japan, Lebanon, Malaysia, Spain, Norway, and United Kingdom. So what are the other key factors that characterize the parliamentary system? A parliamentary system, unlike the presidential system, is characterized by a fusion of legislative and executive branches. It's not characterized by a separation, but a fusion of these two branches. The prime minister and members of the cabinet are also members of the parliament. The principle of responsible government is very central to the parliamentary system. The government is required to have continued support of the popularly elected chamber of the legislature. This is to ensure that the executive is accountable to the legislature. If the cabinet cannot maintain the confidence of the legislature, it is required to resign. So then elections are again called, and the government has to step down, and a new government takes over. So what is so key here is the fact that the executive, that is the prime minister and the cabinet, is completely dependent on the legislature for its continuance. The prime minister or the government cannot exist without the legislature. And there is a fusion of powers, unlike the presidential system. The modern concept of parliamentary system emerged in UK. The system is also called the Westminster system, largely because of the fact that there was a palace of Westminster in which the parliamentary sessions were held. You can see the Palace of Westminster on your screen. The United Kingdom is a constitutional monarchy where the king or queen serves as the legal head of the state but only has ceremonial powers. In republican democracies, the president is usually the head of the state and performs similar ceremonial powers. The actual power is still vested in the cabinet, headed by the prime minister. So we've done with the presidential and parliamentary system. Now we move on to the semi-presidential system. The term semi-presidential system was introduced by Maurice Duverger in a 1980 article. Duverger called a political regime a semi-presidential system if it has three core elements. First element, the president of the republic is elected by universal suffrage. Second, the president possesses quite considerable powers. Third, the president has opposite him a prime minister who possesses executive and governmental power and can stay in office only if the parliament does not show its opposition. So these are the three factors that make a semi-presidential system. That is, the president is popularly elected, the president has a lot of powers, not ceremonial powers, actual powers, and a prime minister and cabinet exist along with the president. Some of the countries that follow semi-presidential systems are Algeria, Egypt, France, Georgia, Mali, Portugal, Russia, Senegal, Sri Lanka, Syria, Tunisia, and Ukraine. So a semi-presidential system combines some of the features of the presidential system and the parliamentary system. Unlike a parliamentary system, the powers of the presidents are substantial. And unlike a presidential system, the president is accountable to the legislature. The president is popularly elected and exists along with the prime minister and cabinet. The president has a fixed term in office, but the cabinet headed by the prime minister does not have a fixed term. They can be brought down by a no-confidence motion that is passed in the legislature. A semi-presidential system hence has a dual power structure. There is a president and also a prime minister. The balance of power oscillates between the president and prime minister depending on whether or not the political party the president is from has a majority in the parliament. If the president and the prime minister are from differing political parties, the president would be more constrained to act. Whereas in the other situation, the prime minister becomes weaker. The main point emerging out of these discussions on the semi-presidential system is the fact that they coexist, both the president and the prime minister, and the fact that the president's term is secure, the prime minister's term is not secure. And there's an interesting power relation between both of them. The classic case of a semi-presidential system is the system of France, the Fifth Republic of France. France had four other republics before it, starting with the French Revolution of the late 1800s. But it is the Fifth Republic in which the semi-presidential system was tried out. In the Fifth Republic, the charismatic figure Charles de Gaulle became the first president of this new republic. This was in 1959. He lasted as a president for 10 years. The response to the parliamentary system in France that existed before the semi-presidential system was mixed. People were quite unhappy with the way parliamentary systems operated, and there was a lot of dissatisfaction among the people about whether the parliamentary system has the ability to get things done. And that's when this charismatic figure of Charles de Gaulle comes along and asks for a semi-presidential system. The constitution was amended and France became the first country with a semi-presidential system. So now we've dealt with all the systems. Let's look at the key differences between these systems. The key differences are in the executive power. In the presidential system, the executive power is singularly with the president, and the head of state is the head of government. In a parliamentary system, the monarch might have some ceremonial executive power, but the actual power is held by the prime minister who heads the cabinet. In the semi-presidential system, the power is divided between the president and the cabinet, which is headed by the prime minister. So that's the difference in the executive power. In terms of separation of power, presidential systems follow clear separation of power. The president and members of cabinet cannot be members of the legislature. The parliamentary system does not believe in separation of powers. It is a fusion of powers. The prime minister and members of the cabinet are usually members of the legislature. Semi-presidential system, it's a combination of both again. The president is not a member of the legislature, but the prime minister and the cabinet are members of the legislature. Now, the third aspect of difference, that is accountability. In the presidential system, the executive is not accountable to the legislature. The president has a fixed term and cannot be removed by a vote of no confidence. In a parliamentary system, the executive is collectively responsible to the legislature. The government is required to have continuous support from the legislature. In a semi-presidential system, the president is not accountable to the legislature, but the prime minister and cabinet is accountable to the legislature. So those are the key differences that emerge those are the key differences between the presidential, parliamentary, and semi-presidential systems. Let us look onto the other facts which determine why we choose a particular system of government. So the choice between presidential, parliamentary, and semi-presidential system is very important. When America was promoting democracies across the world, especially in Latin America, they actually promoted the presidential system. Whereas if you actually look at it, most of the surviving democracies are parliamentary systems. So it was Juan Linz in a 1990 article called The Perils of Presidentialism, who highlighted the fact that the export of the presidential form of democracy by US across the world, especially in Latin America, has been one of the worst exports of USA. He highlighted many of the perils or the major problems of presidentialism. I've highlighted here 4 of them. One is that the president and the legislature have competing claims to legitimacy, and there is no democratic way of resolving conflicts. The second is that the presidential system creates a rigidity that makes it difficult to adjust to certain situations. Even a leader who has lost confidence of his party continues as a president. The third problem which Linz identifies is that the presidential system follows a winner-take-it-all approach. That is, only one person is elected as president. There are no other people in power, so there's indivisibility of power. The fourth one is that since presidents are not dependent upon political parties for their survival, they are largely expected to be intolerant, and they might turn populist and anti-institutionalist. So this is the classic article these were the points which Linz explained in his classic article, which brought out some of the problems with the presidential system. Others have even gone further and explained other problems with the presidential system. Stefan and Skach in 1993 in their article point out that the rate of survival for a parliamentary democracy is 3 times more than that of the presidential system. That is stunning statistics. So they feel that parliamentary systems actually promote mutual dependence and reconciliation, whereas the essence of presidentialism is mutual independence and promotes antagonism. And in terms of deadlock, when there are deadlocks, it's very hard to get out of conflicts. This means that serious conflicts are very hard to be resolved in presidential systems. And often the president takes use of the military and sometimes even suspends the legislature to kind of get absolute power and exercise absolute power in his country. Bruce Ackerman, a legal scholar, has a slightly different take. He rejects both the separation of powers in the presidential system, and is also critical of the British parliamentary system. He feels that the separation of powers of the presidential system actually promotes a cult of personality. Whereas Ackerman also rejects the Westminster style of system followed by Britain because it concentrates power in one institution, the Parliament. He instead favors a new separation of power that is found in constrained parliamentarism, like that of Germany, Italy, Japan, India, Canada, and South Africa. In constrained parliamentarism, no single institution is granted monopoly over lawmaking. While a democratically elected house is in charge of the government, the power of the legislature is actually constrained by other institutions, largely the Constitutional Court. So that is why Ackerman promotes a semi-presidential system. Let's look at some of the large-scale studies that have been done. Jering, Thacker, and Marino, using a global database, found that there's a strong relationship between parliamentarism and good governance. And the reason they come to that conclusion is that they feel that there is a better coordination mechanism in the parliamentary system, whereas that does not exist in the presidential system. However, Chebib, in a 2007 article, actually contests this view. He admits that there's a correlation between presidentialism and regime failure. But he argues that it's very hard to establish a causal relationship between presidentialism and regime failure. He points out that there could be other intervening variables that actually determine the cause of regime failure. There could be deep structures of society, history, that actually determine whether a system fails or not. So the point is, despite the fact that there is a correlation despite the fact that presidential systems are more prone to regime failures, it's very hard to establish a causal link. That is, it's hard to establish that it is because of the constitutional design of the presidential system that regime has failed. It's hard to establish that. Establishing correlation, it's possible. Establishing causal relationship requires much more clear evidence. And this is a fundamental aspect of any social science inquiry. So coming to the last part of the lecture on India's constitutional choice, on November 26, 1949, India made a clear institutional choice, that of having a parliamentary democratic system. That system of government has been described by Douglas Burney as parliamentary federalism, which combines some of the features of the British parliamentary system with some of the American features of judicial review and separation of powers. On 4th November 1948, it was Dr. BR Ambedkar who made his speech introducing the draft of the Constitution. I believe this is a very important speech for all lawyers and political scientists and scholars of Indian history to read. Here he defends why we chose a parliamentary system over a presidential system. He feels that the major issue which any government has to decide, or any constitution makers has to decide is to choose between an executive, a democratic executive which is stable, and a democratic executive which is responsible. Both can exist at the same time, but it can't be at the same measure. One would always be larger than the other. And this is the classic dilemma which constitution makers have. So as he said, it's very difficult to find that balance. The American and Swiss systems give more importance to stability than responsibility. The British system gives more importance to responsibility than stability. So the American executive is a non-parliamentary executive, whereas the British executive depends upon its existence is dependent on the basis of support from the legislature. So that's the major point, to choose between stability and responsibility. What was India's choice? Well, India actually chose stability. And what was India's actual choice? India actually chose responsibility over stability. The major difference in responsibility is between these two systems is also in the way and the time in which the responsibility is held. Under a non-parliamentary system, the assessment of responsibility is periodic. It's not daily. Whereas in a parliamentary system, the assessment is daily as well as periodic. The daily assessment actually takes place through the deliberations in the parliament, whereas the periodic assessment takes place through elections. So you have responsibility assessments both periodic and daily. And that Ambedkar felt is a great feature of the parliamentary system, and he felt the American presidential system lacked it. And that's why he said the draft constitution is recommending the parliamentary system of executive over the presidential system. The parliamentary system has got largely entrenched in the Indian political life. There have been few instances in which it was challenged. During the emergency, there was a question of perhaps shifting to a presidential system, but that was never carried out. Even when the NDA came in power, there was a committee to review the working of the constitution that was set up. Even they actually discussed what are the ways to work with the system, but at the same time the mandate given to the commission was to work within the framework of parliamentary democracy. So the point that is emerging here is the fact that there is a large consensus that Indian parliamentary system is here to stay. There have been few recent critics, B.K. Nehru, Arun Shourie, Shashi Tharoor, who have criticized the parliamentary system and asked for a shift to the presidential system. But if you look at it, all the criticisms are quite, but if you look at it, all of their criticisms are simple, and these can be addressed even without shifting from a parliamentary system to a presidential system. So that pretty much covers what we wanted to discuss as a part of this course on constitutional design, parliamentary system, presidential system, and semi-presidentialism. So let me just wrap up what the key takeaways of today's lecture is. We understood that the presidential system of government is a system in which the executive is chosen by the legislature and is also responsible to the legislature. Whereas presidentialism, lawmaking power is divided between the legislature and the president. A semi-presidential system, the executive power is divided between the president and the prime minister. The key difference, as we notice here, is regarding who has the executive power, whether there is separation of powers, and whether there is accountability of the executive to the legislature. This is the key point of difference. We've already covered that. We also noticed that except America, most of the democracies that endured were parliamentary democracies. Presidential democracies are much more prone to regime failure. There are much more chances for presidential systems to have military coups. So that was also something that we noticed. But one of the contrary views that was coming was, it may not be because of the constitutional design of the presidential system that the regime is failing, but due to various other reasons. So it's true that presidential systems are more prone to failure, but it's very hard to establish it's because of the constitutional design of presidentialism that democracy has failed. And coming to India, we have adopted a constrained parliamentary system in which lawmaking power is not concentrated on one institution, but you have various checks and balances, especially in the form of a constitutional court, in India's case, the Supreme Court of India. And we understood from Ambedkar's speech that while choosing between a stable executive and a responsible executive, we preferred a responsible executive. But as I said, the way the parliament has worked in India, the way the democracy has worked in India, it's got completely entrenched in the heart and soul of India. And the fact remains that parliamentary system has become a fundamental feature of Indian society. And I feel that the system is here to stay, and we do not probably expect a change in that system. Hope all of you learned quite a bit through this lecture. I had a very good time talking to you, all of you. Thank you.